Yeah, there you go. A little overview, what we're going to have in this workshop. This workshop is going to be about characterization and world building. We're going to briefly discuss what it is, when it's useful, and how to upgrade it. But the focus of this workshop is going to be on using your own experiences to feed characterization and go walking through some examples of how we can do that. I am going to ask everyone who can and whose camera isn't broken to please turn on their camera, because it's really difficult to give a workshop to people, to black squares, as opposed to real life human beings. So it will be very helpful if everyone who can does turn on their camera. All right. So we are going to go briefly through characterization and world building, but there are existing workshops on black squares is high art. But there are existing workshops, so I'm not going to spend too much time on what it is exactly, and I'm going to focus more on how to use characterization and world building, how to upgrade it to the highest possible level, and how to think of good characterizations and world buildings and base it off of your own experiences. I will preface that obviously all of this is based off of my own debate experience and things that have worked for me and feedback that I have gotten. There is a broad variety of ways to go about characterizing and world building and doing things like that. So this is not all encompassing and it's not set in stone, but I encourage you to try and use these methods. Also, I'm going to use some examples that I have used in the past and that have worked for me, obviously, just because it's easier for me to recall my own things. But this isn't to say that I don't have a lot to improve in world building and characterization as well. And there are many other excellent speakers who use it. So that's the only reason why I'm using my own examples. So let's discuss characterization and world building a second and understand what I actually think it is. And the first thing to note, and that's really important for me because one of the most common questions I got on the form where you signed up for this workshop was, how do I integrate between my characterization and my argument? Or how do I make sure my characterization is relevant to my argument? And I think that there is a tendency to think that these things are separate. So my characterization or my world building or my framing is different in some meaningful way from my argument, and it's two separate sections of my speech, and I need to work hard to integrate them. I want to challenge this perception of what world building and framing is, because I think that they are often one and the same. And characterization and world building can be your argument. So if there is some clash in the debate about if something is going to happen, and it is your world building and your characterization that explains why it does actually happen in the way that you want it, then for that framing or characterization or whatever you think it is in fact your argument, and it is not entirely separate. But even if what you're using is characterization to enhance an argument and to make it seem more likely or that you're reaching your impacts, that is also just part of your argument and inherently related. And I think this is important because one of the most common mistakes I see people making when it comes to characterization is thinking about these things separately and spending a lot of time characterizing things that don't actually impact your argument or the debate in any meaningful way. So people will spend a lot of time explaining to me why a motion is most likely set in developing countries, and then go on to analyze things that aren't specific to developing countries in any shape, way, or form. So at best, what this means is you've wasted time on something that's not important. And time is one of the most important resources when you only have 7 minutes to a speech. So you want to make sure you're not giving characterizations that aren't important and spending time on that. But at worst, I've seen people give characterizations that actively harm the point they're trying to make, for example, by limiting the scope of their impacts to a very specific subgroup of people when that's not important or not necessarily relevant, and all it does is minimize the impact because it's saying it only affects a small amount of people rather than everyone. So when thinking about characterization and thinking about how to do world building, don't think of it as something you have to do that's separate for your arguments. Think of it as something that you are doing as an argument or in addition to your arguments, incorporated into your arguments and is meaningfully part of them and not entirely separate. Another thing I want to address before moving forward is that what is characterization and what is world building and what is framing and all of these things. I think there's a lot of overlapping of the meanings of each of these terms and all of these jargons in a way that ends up being confusing. So the way I think about it is that characterization, and we'll delve deep into what this means particularly, but it's basically asking ourselves in depth who the motion is impacting and what the circumstances they're acting in and how that impacts them. And world building is taking the aggregation of all of the different things, all of the different actors and all of the different circumstances to paint a clear picture of how the world and all of those moving parts come together. So world building effectively is an aggregation of different characterizations, and characterization is a single instance, and framing, the way people use it in debate is usually basically the same as characterization. So I'm reframing the debate as I'm adding a new characterization that makes some meaningful impact in how the debate plays out. So that is what I think all of these things mean, but I think that often they're just used interchangeably and thrown out there to mean basically the same thing. So I might use them interchangeably within this workshop, but know that that's what I mean. So let's move on to what actually is characterization and world building. And here I think that there are three things or three questions that I ask myself in order to understand that. The first thing I do is I ask myself, who is the motion impacting? Who are the actors in the motions? Now, this can be a variety of different things. This can be individuals. It can be groups of individuals in social movements or in other social structures, families, communities, things like that. It can be formalized organizations, and it can be political structures like governments or different bureaus within governments or things like that. And the thing I would encourage you to do is challenge the assumption that the actors we're talking about in a debate are often they are a single entity or monolithic to some extent, and challenge that assumption and break it down into its actual different components. So often there isn't a single feminist movement. It has to do with many individuals making decisions together. And even in governments, there are many different bureaus, many different ministries, there are many different jobs. So there might be a prime minister and then ministers and then members of parliament. And all of these people have different potential incentives and things like that. So the first thing I would note is that thank you, I now have tea. Challenging the assumption that things are monolithic and taking a look at all of the different levels of hierarchy of actors being impacted, whether it's individuals, groups, organizations, etc. The second is asking yourself what the circumstances they're acting in. So who else is in their environment? Often is an important question to ask to figure out not only who is impacted by the motion, but who isn't impacted by the motion in a way that does impact the actor that is impacted. So I'll give you an example. In the motion, this house would teach women to be selfish, okay, or supports teaching women to be selfish or something like that. The immediate actor in the motion that I want to analyze and discuss the characterization of is women themselves, because they're the ones directly impacted. But if I take a step back and ask myself, okay, but who else is in women's environments? And I realize that men are still going to make up a significant part of that environment and aren't directly impacted by teaching women to be selfish. What does the world look like when women want to be more selfish, but men don't let them? Might be an active question in the debate that's important. But I only reach that question if I ask myself, who else is in their environment? Now, obviously, who else is in their environment can be also other individuals or other groups of individuals, other organizations, other political structures, etc. So it's all the same kinds of actors, but sort of expanding the view to understand who I'm analyzing or I am talking about, who are they impacted by. The other thing is what else makes up their world. So not only other actors, but just natural phenomenon or occurrences happening around them. So I recently saw a meme and yes, this is going to be a recurring theme. I look at memes and reels and then I translate them into how they're useful in debates. And I think that's important. But I saw a meme about, what was it? I think it was someone from The Office laughing a very clearly fake laugh, and talking about how this is millennials when throughout their lives they've experienced 9/11 and COVID and 2 economic crises and several wars, etc. And all of these things are things that impact the individuals. They impact our viewpoint, they impact the knowledge of the world, they impact aims and goals. And if I don't analyze them, if I'm not aware of them, then they might be helpful to me and I'm not acknowledging them, but also I might be vulnerable to some kind of rebuttal. And then you have to ask yourself how they interact with the actor that I am analyzing. So how often? So you could say that maybe, but millennials don't even think about COVID that often. So it doesn't matter that it exists in their system, or say that, of course, it exists in their system because it's something you can't avoid. People are constantly getting tested. People are sharing. The trauma of your world suddenly being turned upside down is still very salient. So it impacts people in the long term. But you want to ask yourself how often so that you can use that to your advantage, and also under which circumstances. Maybe I'm not constantly thinking about COVID, but maybe before I make big life decisions, for example, if I want to make a decision whether to move far away from my family, at that point, the reality of if there's lockdown, I'll be far away from them hits me. So it's not just how often, but which circumstances and which kinds of decisions is it going to impact me making? And then the last question is how it's going to impact it. And here I have sort of 4 places where I like to focus on, which is how it impacts the needs a person has. So if all of their basic needs are met, what are the other needs that they have? If they have been taught that having a relationship is incredibly important, does that make a relationship a need for them? The second is, how does it change what they want or desire? The third is how it changes the knowledge that they have. So people can have different types of knowledge or access to different knowledge depending on where they are in the world. So if someone is living in a country where they have limited access to information, then they have different knowledge than other people do. And if I live in a world where I'm constantly exposed to incredible amounts of information, then that also changes the knowledge that I have, because it means that I don't necessarily know what's real, not real, and how to differentiate between facts and not facts and fake news. And this also impacts my psychological biases, which is the last one, which is what am I inclined to believe? What am I inclined to want? What am I inclined to prioritize, whether it's justified or not justified within all of that noise? So this is broadly how I like to break down characterization and world building and all of those circumstances. Are there any questions about these things? I'm sort of breezing through them to get to the main part.
Just a technical question. Was what I asked you in the chat.
Okay, no, I don't have a PowerPoint for this one.
That's great. I was just not sure, and I didn't want us to continue. If there is
okay. I do have a document with all of this, and I could probably turn it into a PowerPoint, but because the focus of this workshop is going to be later on, where we're going to maybe watch some videos and break down how I take characterization away from that, I thought it was less important, but if it's important, then I can send it to people later. Any questions about this part of what actually is characterization and world building and how we can break it down to find those?
Yes, I'm unsure if this is going to come later, but this sounds like a lot of questions in a very small period of time, especially like a lot of branching questions in a very small period of time.
That's very fair. I think it will come a little bit later. But you need to focus. I think the way I take a look at this is I use it as a cheat sheet. So I might have it prepped in advance of here are all the different questions I can ask myself. And I don't take the time to answer every single question in this list. I sort of read through it and I try to recognize what area am I talking about and what's more likely to impact each other. So I ask myself, for example, am I talking about individuals or groups of individuals or organizations or political structures? And I don't spend a lot of time answering which are the individuals or groups of individuals in the motion, rather than recognizing, okay, I'm talking about individual people and I'm impacting individual relationships. Moving on. So what is in the environment of individual people? And is this impacting their needs, or is this impacting some bias? And that depends on what the bottom line I'm trying to prove is. And a reminder that all of this should be done in the context of an argument and not different from an argument. So at the point where you're walking through and thinking about characterization, you should already know vaguely what the bottom line that you are trying to prove and that you are trying to get at is, and prioritize the questions accordingly. So if I'm trying to prove that the United States is going to make some decision, I'm not going to talk about the specific, I'm not necessarily going to talk about your average Joe individual living in California, because that's not so relevant. And when I ask myself who else is in their environment, the people who most directly affect them are probably other governments that exist. So I'm going to prioritize the questions I'm focusing on based on the arguments that I've chosen, and understand which of them are more important to the bottom line. Good, great. Moving on. So I will note that when is it useful and when can we notice that characterization is going to be an incredibly important part of my argument and what I'm trying to prove. So here, I want to say that almost in every single round is going to involve some actor making some decision based off of something, and if it's impacts or anything else. So characterization is almost always going to be important to some extent in the round. But there are sort of default places that I think that when I see them, it's like raising a flag and saying, notice that here it can be particularly helpful or particularly useful. And there are I'm going to divide this into specific kinds of impacts that I'm trying to prove and particular types of motions that I think it's relevant. So when it comes to impact, there are two kinds of impacts that if I'm trying to prove them, I note and I utilize characterization as much as possible. The first is irrational decisions. So if I'm trying to prove that an actor is going to make some irrational decision, often it's unintuitive because it's not rational. And I think this is an inherent problem in debate. So if you were to ask me if there is some kind of argument that debate doesn't give enough credit to on a regular basis, my answer would be debate just doesn't credit people are dumb enough. Because we like to give structural reasons for why this is the right decision and this is the rational decision. And of course, when I ask myself if I want to spend $200 on skincare this week, or I want to put it away in a savings account so I can someday buy a house, I sit down and I do calculations and I understand and explain to myself that a house, no, I don't do that, right? The reality is we make irrational decisions on a very daily basis, and all of us do it, but it's really hard to prove why we do it, because the reasons are, just because I'm dumb, because I didn't take the time to think, because I was lazy. But that's a really difficult thing to prove to a judge that people actually do when all reasons point to taking an irrational step. But if I can show you that from my point of view in that moment, the forces that are applied to me make it so that it makes more sense, or it's easier for me to make that decision, then it makes things more likely. So I'll take one example. One case I think it was a motion about I think it was protests, or it was some government action, and our case was to prove that protests are going to lead to violence at the end of the day. And proving that violence is going to happen in an unstructured way is kind of difficult in debate, in my opinion, because it almost never makes sense for me to attack someone and to initiate violence as an individual. And if what I'm trying to prove is that an individual is going to instigate violence and put themselves in danger, I need to either explain why violence is the best thing for them at the moment, or explain why they're making an irrational decision that puts themselves in danger. And it's really hard to give like a list of reasons why someone would, because often when someone chooses to be violent, it's not because they have, oh, these are 3 reasons for me to be violent. It's because the emotions and forces applied on them in the moment make it so that they are either making an irrational decision or that it seems like the most rational decision for them to make at the moment. So the way I can go about analyzing this is explain why after some occurrence happens, we have to first characterize who the people who are going to protest are. These are individuals who care a lot about whatever policy or whatever it is that the government just did and decided that they're going to go out and protest. This means that emotions already run high at this point in time among this group of people because they felt strongly enough to get up off of their butts in the couch and be outside on the street protesting. And sometimes this will cause counter protests because especially things that aren't in consensus or things that are controversial, people have an active incentive or they want to either prevent the government from doing something or prevent the government from caving to opposition to doing something. So you have people protesting either for or against something that they feel very, very strongly about, and people walking around next to each other as a result of this. Now, all it takes is for someone to accidentally walk in someone's path or accidentally push against someone. So you have many people in a crowded street walking right next to each other. Often you don't even know if the people support you or are against you. People walking next to each other, it's bound to happen that someone accidentally walks into someone. Now, if the subject of protest is contentious enough that you think that the other side might be looking for a fight and someone pushes into you, now you're scared. So now emotions were already running high and you're scared and you think negatively of the people on the other side. So it seems plausible to you that someone pushed into you looking for a fight. And the rational thing for you to do now is to push back so that they don't try and fight you and don't harm you. Because if you think someone is going to attack you, the logical thing to do is to attack you back. So this includes creating an irrational decision. And obviously this analysis wasn't perfect, but if you paint a picture of what people are feeling at that moment in time and what their perception and knowledge of the world is in a way that makes that decision seem less irrational and actually like a smart decision on their part, it makes it easier to analyze why people are likely to make those decisions anyways. And I think the same kind of unlikely scenarios applies to what we call slippery slope arguments, right? So it demands us proving one thing happens that leads to a chain reaction of many different things happening, and at the end having some impact. Now, often proving that things actually happen in this way is incredibly difficult, but if you take a second to explain why things often do lead to this kind of emotional reaction or do lead to this kind of chain reaction by characterizing the circumstances caused by it, it can make it more likely. The second kind of impact that I think it's useful to use characterization for is sort of day-to-day impacts or psychological impacts, things that it's difficult for us to prove why they're important because they're more abstract. For example, something will cause someone anxiety and to feel less confident in themselves. Fine, so they feel some anxiety and feel less confident. I'm sure that's unpleasant, but is that a debate-winning impact? Do I really care if someone feels less confident and has some anxiety? If I manage to characterize how this impacts things on a day-to-day basis, then I can make that impact sound significantly larger and be significantly more important in the debate. So if I explain why, if someone is not confident, for example, in school and doesn't believe in themselves, and has just genuine issues with self-confidence, it's going to impact their life in various different places. So it means that I'm not going to talk to people or have the courage to go and try and make friends because I don't feel like I'm good enough or interesting enough for them, which means that I'm going to limit my social abilities significantly. When it comes to choosing classes and trying to go for advanced classes or things that interest me, if I believe that I'm setting myself up for failure, I'm not even going to take those chances in advance. So I'm going to limit myself for those opportunities. if there is a job opportunity that I'm not fully qualified for, but think I might be able to do a good job in, if I'm not confident enough, then I also think I'm setting myself up for failure, and I'm not going to even try. And the point here is, if you can characterize many different points in...
Palestinian prisoners are going to be...
Okay, I think that was some news we heard there. Can characterize many different points in time or many different situations where people are going to be impacted by this, then you can utilize the characterization in order to make your impacts, expand your impacts, make them larger, and make them feel like they're more important, or not like they're more important than they are, but make people understand and prove in a debate how actually meaningful they are for people's day-to-day lives. And then there are those are the types of impacts, and the types of motions that they're very common in are obviously actor motions. So if you want to characterize a specific actor, then that is, actor motions are classically motions where characterization is going to be used. Anything that has to do with decision making. So actually, when it comes to IR or econ, when it comes to things like what decisions are world leaders going to make, I find characterization incredibly important, especially in motions that discuss things like mutually assured destruction and whether things lead to more harta'a.
Deterrence.
Yes, deterrence. Thank you. More deterrence or more aggression. So how many motions have you had to debate where the question was, is China going to be deterred, or is China going to get more aggressive as a result of some policy? I don't know, it could go either way, or Russia is going to be more deterred, or Russia is going to be more aggressive. Who knows? If you characterize how leaders are making their decisions and what's important to them, then you can prove that it goes to either side of that. And many relationship motions I find that are classic for characterization and how people feel within relationships, whether it's familial or romantic. And also any narrative messaging motion where the point is how people receive the message and what they're likely to get it, and all of what message they're likely to receive, all of those things. All of these motions are classically motions that I think characterization would be very useful in. And now just to a few points about how I think you can upgrade your characterization, because I also got several questions on how to make my characterization better, or how to use advanced characterization or things like this, because in high rooms you need to do characterization well in order to win. And I have a few comments here. The first is just be real. One of the common mistakes I see is people trying to characterize things that are just unintuitive, or just things that I won't believe no matter how much you try to prove to me. Like, people try to characterize I don't know, if someone tried to prove to me that the Israeli government was stable at the moment, it doesn't matter how many mechanisms or characterizations you give to me, I'm just not going to believe it. It's not true. So the first is, when you're characterizing something, try and figure out if what you're saying is intuitive or unintuitive. This, I think, is a very common mistake. Up until now, I think that it is one of the reasons that we dropped out of our open quarters at Euros, because we were trying to characterize that people don't have any exposure to sexual content outside of pornography. Honestly, it doesn't matter how many mechanisms I give you to try and characterize that, you're not going to believe it. It's just not true. So the first thing I'll say is, just when you are giving characterization, be charitable to what's reasonable and what's unreasonable and what's just not true. The second is relevance to your case. So I already talked about not needing to characterize for characterization's sake. So only if it's important or relevant, go for it. But also focus on the important parts of your characterization. So if someone is going to, what part of the characterization is someone going to argue with? So for example, on this house would, let me think about it a second. This house would ban cigarettes, right? Are people going to argue with me on the characterization of the fact that cigarettes are harmful to people's lives? Less so. Are they going to maybe argue with me on how people are going to react to whether or not it's harmful on to the fact that it's banned and whether we're going to get a black market or not get a black market, they might. So when I'm characterizing people's decisions, I want to focus on the part of characterization that's important for me to win the debate and not on everywhere in the characterization. So that is the first way you can upgrade your characterization, is recognize what is going to be the most relevant for your case, what is most likely to be attacked, and focus on that. So in messaging motions, for example, often I think that is where messaging leads to action. So I'll see a lot of things on whether social justice movements should use X messaging over Y messaging. And the basic argument goes, this messaging is more convincing to people, therefore we get more support. And you characterize what the message looks like, and you characterize that people are convinced, and therefore you've characterized more support. But what you haven't characterized at this point is, does that support lead to anything meaningful? So what you want to prove is that people are making decisions that lead to better outcomes for that social justice movement, where you want to focus your characterization is why that leads people to make different decisions. And I think a good example of how you can use day-to-day impacts to impact motions comes from this, because even if you're not proving policy motions, even if you stop at more people are convinced of something, if you can prove that their day-to-day behavior has a meaningful impact, then you can prove that that's impactful. So let's say I've convinced more men of the feminist cause, but I haven't convinced them enough to go to rallies. I haven't convinced them enough to go to protest or change their voting power. So what have I done? Maybe for some of those men are business owner and I'm changing their hiring practices. Maybe some of those men now genuinely have internalized that telling women to smile doesn't make them feel good, it makes them feel bad. Maybe some of those men have internalized that comments that they have previously made are uncomfortable and don't make women feel comfortable. And if I can expand this impact and also explain why for most women, the hardest part is the day-to-day sense that they are being objectified by men is the thing that harms them a lot the most, then I've now taken something that is just an abstract, I've convinced someone to support a cause, to something that actually has an impact on people's lives. And so it's focusing on the relevance to your case. And then that leads me to also strategic relevance. So using the characterization to explain how it actually changes the bottom line of things and not just leave it at this is characterization and giving that bottom line. 4 is generalizability. And here is where I think examples get a bad reputation for no good reason. I think often in feedback we can hear, oh, that was example-based, or you know what, even more in rebuttal. Someone will give a rebuttal, oh, that's just one example, but here are 5 counterexamples. So example isn't something that can actually stand. And I think the mistake that people make here is is one of 2 things. You either use a specific example without then going through the process of the general mechanisms that allowed this example to happen and why these set of circumstances is likely to happen again and again and again and again. So it's not enough just to say, here's an example of where US intervention in foreign policy of other countries went wrong. You want to then take that example, study it, and understand why that's likely to continue happening in other places. And the way to do that is either give the example and then say, look at why this is likely to repeat happening and give the characterization in that way. Or what I like to do is sort of use an average Joe example. I'm not going to give a specific example of a specific occurrence that happened in a moment in time, but I'm going to describe a situation for you in a way that makes you understand that this example could happen in many different places. So in a debate about school uniforms, for example, whether to force them or not force them, I support school uniforms. In my case, is that when there is a hierarchy based off of what people wear that harms people's psyche. So I'm not going to give you an example of, Yael went to school yesterday and felt bad because everyone was wearing Gucci and she was wearing H&M. What I am going to describe to you is, you are a new kid in school or even an old kid in school and you reach school and you want to make friends, but you are very clearly marked as a separate from them. You are very clearly not of their status, and it's in a way that you can't actually hide because it's something that you have to constantly have on your body and you have no choice about. It's a thing that is visible, so people constantly can make fun of it from you, and you can't choose to wear anything else because you don't have the money or your family is incapable of giving that to you. So from the get-go, you feel like you're marked as separate, so you're not going to approach them and you're going to feel bad. And it's something you can't hide about yourself no matter how much you want, because you can't go to school naked, or you could, but that would be worse. So this is an example that's not a specific example of a specific occurrence, but it's sort of saying, imagine you're this person, and it's putting you in the place of that person. And allowing you to use that example that is already sort of generalized to present the generalizable mechanisms. And those are the things I would focus on to upgrade your characterization. Now, before we reach the next and main parts, in my opinion, of this workshop, I'm happy to answer questions about this part that happened up until now.
Yeah, I have a question. So in terms of like prioritization, what's worth spending most time on in terms of like characterization stuff?
So I think that it really depends on what you're trying to prove. So like my answer from before, basically you're choosing an argument and then you want to base what you're focusing on in characterization on what will be the most effective or help me the most in proving my specific argument. So I think the first question to ask yourself is this characterization going to be contested? So is this something that the other side has an incentive to argue with me over? And if so, that means it's probably higher in priority, so I would prioritize that. And the second is, do my impacts entirely depend on this characterization? So if I'm characterizing what makes people get up off their couches and actually go protest, that it's probably dependent on my characterization that what makes people or what drives people to action. Or if my case is entirely dependent on China being aggressive as a result of some policy, then characterization of how China makes decisions on whether or not to be aggressive is important because my case is entirely dependent on it. So I guess you can ask yourself, one, is this likely to be contested? And two, do my impacts depend on this characterization? And if the answer to one of those is yes, then you can recognize it as something that's important and prioritize it there. Any more questions? All right, so moving on. Oh, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, my microphone went off. So there, for all of the examples you gave, there is the option to add them integrated to specific arguments. But a lot of the times, I see in speeches, people take their characterization and world building to an external point. Because I can give an argument about what makes China makes the decision X and Y as an independent argument, or the first link in an argument about why they will make decision X. So under what circumstances do you make the decision to integrate it inside an argument or make it a standalone argument on its own?
It really depends what I need to do to win the debate at a specific moment in time. So if I am extending and the top half clashes on whether or not China will be aggressive, then the characterization is in and of itself an argument. It's not part of an argument. This is the thing that's going to decide which side on top half is correct and prove to you that it goes to my side. And therefore the characterization is in and of itself an argument. In which case I would just give it as such. Otherwise, if I am OG and I'm trying to prove that China will be as aggressive as a result of a policy, then what I should do is integrate that characterization into my argument to prove why it's more likely to go to my side. So it depends on the debate, it depends on what my strategy is, and it depends on what I need to do in order to win the debate. So there isn't a set answer to this. The one thing I will make sure I always do is ask myself, what is the bottom line of this characterization? Why am I focusing on it? And sometimes that answer will be because it wins the debate in and of itself. And sometimes that answer will be because it's necessary to prove a different part of my point that will win the debate on its own. But I will always ask myself, why is this characterization important? And based off of my answer, decide A, whether I need to spend time on it or not, and B, where to place it in my speech. Cool. All right. Moving on to my favorite part of this. So another question that I got on the forum, and I think is super legitimate and a good one, is, look, you have 15 minutes of prep. You have 15 minutes of prep, you get a motion, and it's really hard to build an entire world and understand all of the different aspects and what's interacting with what in 15 minutes and give time to analyze and prepare for the debate. How can I possibly think of my characterization and build an entire world in 15 minutes? I can't even think about it in 15 minutes, so I'm definitely not going to be able to analyze it in addition to other things. So what am I supposed to do? And my favorite way of going about this is really to just build upon my own experiences, whether it's my own lived experiences or whether it's things I've seen in TV shows or even reels on TikTok and Instagram or articles and books that I've read. I think that our day-to-day experiences are a treasure trove of understanding mechanisms and how people make decisions and all sorts of things that happen in real life if we only just ask ourselves the right questions. And I want to be clear, I don't think that our experiences are meant to serve the debate purpose. So I don't think that our experiences only have a value or are important to us just because they serve debate, but they're things that we're going to do anyways because we experience things constantly no matter what, and we watch TV no matter what, and we are probably browsing TikTok or Instagram or your social media of choice no matter what, and we're all reading articles and doing things like that, and it doesn't take much to use those things in a debate context and also utilize them to win. So your experiences are important regardless of their debate value, but insofar as debate is something you value, we can take advantage of those. And we can take advantage because we have experiences in many, many different contexts. We all have some form of relationships, whether it's romantic or not romantic, friendships, family, with coworkers, with teachers, with people in our class. We understand social dynamics and our own personal experience of them. We all have school or work or some form of structure that we belong to. We have our hobbies. We have day-to-day experiences of taking the bus or going to the supermarket and what things like that look like. And we've all encountered some conflict in the necessity for decision-making. So we can really build on those experiences. And I think the first step in asking myself and understanding those experiences fully and in a way that I can break down and generalize is also recognize how those experiences make me feel. So I'll try and recognize the emotion. Often that will just be curiosity, like, why do people behave in this way? Or why do I behave in this way? It's strange to me. It's something I haven't experienced, or it's hard for me to explain. So I'll take the time to try and explain it to myself and understand why it's happening. It can be incredulity, which is like the next step from curiosity. It's, I can't believe anyone would behave in this way, or I don't understand how we got to the situation we are in today about this. And then I spend more time trying to explain to myself, how can it be that this is a situation that occurs? I think one step over that is probably anger or frustration. How can it be? This is so unjust, or it's so dumb, or I can't believe I'm acting in this way, either at existing structures or myself. Like, why is this a reality that I try to understand why it happens? And it can be emotions like just wonder and beauty. I can look at a piece of art and experience, wow, a sense of wonder, and ask myself, what is it that I am enjoying in this moment? Or I can watch a TV show and enjoy it a lot and ask myself, why am I enjoying it so much? Why is it so interesting to me? Why am I so involved in it? And when you ask yourself, why do you like the things that you like? Why do you act in the way that you act? Or why do other people around you like things or dislike things? Or why you do it so well? You can build upon those things in debate in order to characterize. So one place in which I've used my own personal lived experiences, and I'll give you an example to sort of exemplify the thought process, is the motion was, this House believes that it's in the interest of independent secessionist movements to prioritize creating autonomous zones within pre-existing countries over full-on statehood. And the personal experience I have with that is understanding that if you are within conflicts, within a certain confine of geography, then unfortunately, it's not that easy to completely secede and be an independent state because you have a lot of interdependent infrastructure. And especially if one of those bodies has significantly more power than the other body, then that body has a lot of power that determines whether or not the new state is going to be successful or unsuccessful, manage to develop itself, not develop itself, control a lot of its economy, control a lot of its ability to trade, whether it's by controlling ports, whether it's controlling airports, whether it's just being more powerful, whether it has existing trade agreements and more political capital than a different state. There are a lot of ways where it can impact the viability. So let's say a new state exists, fine, you have your geographic section that's all yours. That doesn't actually lead to being independent in any way, and you're going to need the goodwill of the more powerful state no matter what, which means that autonomous zone is a better idea than a state. And this is just because I took a look at the structures that I know from my life. I took the time to ask myself, why does this exist? Even if it angers me, why does it exist? What are the mechanisms that exist? And I managed to explain that to myself, but it's just because I had that. Now, this is my own personal lived experience, but another way in which this can come up is in TV shows and pop culture. I'll give you an example. So who here has watched Inventing Anna or The Dropout? One person. Okay. Oh, two people. Anton, give us a brief overview of what Inventing Anna is about.
So, not Inventing Anna, but The Dropout, and it's basically the story of, I think I've heard, but basically she's a programmer, but she did not do that well mentally in terms of like, she was trying to develop, I think I forgot.
Don't worry about it.
Watch it again. I'm so sorry.
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's about a story of Elizabeth Holmes, she was studying chemistry and she was advancing very well, and she created her own firm to identifying illnesses from taking just a drop of blood from your finger, and it ran really, really well for a while, but due to the fact of it being very ill researched and her being very mentally unstable and basically a fraud, it didn't go well, and she was convicted of fraud. Actually, recently, this is why the show was made, and
yeah, that's exactly it. And Inventing Anna is similar, and I think the connecting tie between the both is they're both stories of smart and charming young women that convince smart and seasoned business people to give them money while consistently defrauding them. And the question, I saw this TV show, I saw both of the TV shows, and the question I was left with, the emotion I was left with was really incredulity. Like, how could it be that business people who are experienced, who have been successful, who have gone through the process of due diligence time and time again, how could it be that these people were defrauded? Like, what did they miss? What is the connect? Like, why does someone not do their proper due diligence? And I'm not talking about just business, but also friends that lent them airplanes because they were promised that they would be paid back. Like, who just gives someone a plane because they trust that it will be brought back and give? I really found myself struggling to understand how could it be that the processes of due diligence that are so ingrained into the business world and in the investment world just didn't work in these circumstances. And I spent time thinking about it and thought about how social relationships cloud people's judgment by impacting, one, the knowledge that they have, tapping into their psychological biases that they have, and upping the stakes for their incentives and their desires. So if we break this down a second, the knowledge that they think they have tips the scales in likelihood of being defrauded, right? If I know the person, and if I know they know other people, and if I have the sense that other people trust them, it means that the likelihood that they're defrauding me is lower, in my opinion, because they wouldn't do that, or they couldn't convince other people to support them if they were liars and fraudsters. So already the knowledge that I have about the world has changed and shifted in a way that means my guard is a little bit down. Second, it impacts my psychological biases, because if I'm already friendly with them, if I've already met them and I've joked with them and I've trusted them, I don't want to admit that I was wrong, especially if part of my job is recognizing when people are lying to me and being skeptical. So there's a high threshold for me to going back, admitting I was wrong. So even if I start to have suspicions about this person, the threshold for me actually investigating it is kind of high, because I want to convince myself that I didn't miss anything before. I also want to believe that I'm a good judge of character, but more importantly, I don't want to believe that my friends are bad judges of character. So if this person is friends with my other friends and I start questioning them, I'm not questioning only my own judgment, I'm questioning the judgment of many people around me in my social circle. All of this means that my psychological threshold for being suspicious, and not only being suspicious, but actively taking action about it, is kind of high, because it requires me to think negative things, not only about myself, but other people I care for. And lastly, it ups the stakes for my needs and desires. Because if I do something about it, and if I seem like I'm overly cautious, then I am risking a friendship that might have emotional and social value to me. I am risking being valued in this person's eyes that I obviously value back. I'm also risking surrounding friendships that have emotional and social value to me, because I'm obviously, like I said, not only implying negative things about me, but negative things about other investors or other friends that they have. So I'm risking them as well. And that means that I'm risking generally my social standing and the state and people's perception of my competence, especially if I'm not sure and think I might be wrong. So as long as there is a chance that I'm wrong, it means that the expected value of confronting them and making sure I go through with the processes of due diligence skews more negative than it is in real life, because the stakes for me if I'm wrong are incredibly high. And because this impacts my knowledge, psychological biases, and ups the stakes, it means that I'm less likely to do due diligence even if I'm suspicious. How is this useful in debate? Any debate about people irrationally not taking steps they should have taken can be informed by the things I just noticed. Because if I think that in social situations or certain social contexts can mean people make bad decisions, then I can now replicate this. So I'll give you an example. In a competition about 2 years ago, I had the motion, this house supposes the phenomenon of founders of companies staying on board in meaningful leadership roles after the IPO. My case from closing government in that debate was talking about how the social structures that are created around founders of companies in these situations means that markets can't apply the due diligence, and the people who are supposed to be responsible for holding those founders accountable can't do their job. And I used analysis that I took from Inventing Anna after asking myself, how could it be that this happened, and breaking it down into different pieces and understanding why it means that people are not going to hold them accountable and they have too much power and are inevitably going to make a mistake and be worse. And this is just one example of a case in which I watched something and I thought that it could be helpful. Another example is I read a lot of Dear Therapist articles where people talk a lot about their relationships and how they're frustrated. So people in some relationship situation are usually frustrated either by their own feelings and decision making or by their partners. And the emotion I feel reading these articles is one of curiosity and maybe a little bit of frustration, right? It's like, why do people make decisions that are so clearly bad for them, or stay in relationships that are so clearly bad for them at the end of the day? And the conclusion that I reached, not on my own, but also through reading the articles, is that sometimes a relationship isn't a relationship. Or not only a relationship. It's a means to fulfill some other subconscious need that we have. This could mean fixing past experiences. So if I had avoidant parents, I'm going to want an avoidant boyfriend so that I can fix it and make him less avoidant and therefore win in whatever weird abstract argument I'm in with my parents. Maybe it's just certainty. So if I had avoidant parents and now I have an avoidant girlfriend, maybe it's not the best for me, but that's what I know how to deal with, so it's familiar and it's safe because I've already learned to engage with it. Maybe I have a savior complex and want to date an addict so that I can save them. There are all sorts of reasons why people make bad decisions about the relationship that they're in and within a relationship that I just gathered from reading all of these articles. How is this useful in a debate? Any debate that has to do with romantic relationships, I can take this and utilize it. So this house opposes arranged marriages. You want to be up, you want to be pro-arranged marriages. Prop wants to say people choose good partners. Boom, I have ready rebuttal. Characterize how people choose their partners and why often they're making decisions that are actively bad for them and not good for them, and you need a subjective view in order to make better decisions about who you're compatible with. I just made my life 5 times easier by reading an article on 2 of The Atlantic. For this next example, I guess I will share my screen. Okay, I can't open it in advance. Let's do this. All right. So these are things from TikTok. Wait, I need to share my sound too. Let's see if I can do that. Share sound. Great. Okay, so now we're going into the realms of social media and Instagram.
Ronaldo! Manchester United win! It's Cristiano Ronaldo! On this big Ronaldo down towards Lingard. Ronaldo! Manchester United win! It's Cristiano Ronaldo! On this big
Okay, that's 1. Here's 2. This is just 1 to read. There isn't anything else there. And lastly,
River! Quit! No, that's yucky. No.
all right, so what did we actually watch here? Basically, we watched 3 reels that I happened to encounter while I was tired after a long work day and just browsing on my phone. And really, I could have just scrolled past them and not thought of anything else. But if I take a second to ask myself why these things are happening, the one with the child celebrating for the wrong team especially caught me. Because the emotion, the thing that is the connecting feature between all of these is that children are doing something that we think is cute or funny because their context is off. And this inspired in me an emotion or a sense of curiosity where I asked myself, why is it that children do this? What are the behaviors that children learn, and does it have an impact? And I reached the conclusion that children learn so much more than words, language, or knowledge from their surroundings and their parents. So a child is learning the correct social behavior and what is expected of them when watching a soccer match. And they're in the process of learning, right? But they know that when a goal is scored, you have to be happy because maybe they haven't seen a goal being scored and their dad being sad yet. So they know they should be happy. So they were happy. Then they look at their dad, they see, oh no, this is the wrong emotion, and they self-correct. Or they ask themselves, how do we behave in nature with puddles? And because they've grown up with dogs that they probably think are the right social behavior, they drink it. Or because they're so used to saying Alexa, then they accidentally call their teacher Alexa. But the point is that a lot of these are social behaviors that they are mapping and learning from their surroundings, whether it's parents, dogs, or anyone else. And the conclusion is that the impact of the relationships that children have with their surroundings goes so much deeper than the knowledge that they have, but it's their patterns of behavior that they're developing. So in any debate about familial relationships, this house prefers a world where love is seen as conditional rather than unconditional, for example. I can strongly impact the relationship between parent and child, and specifically how this makes people behave, because I can explain how this makes authority figures behave has long-term impacts for not only perpetuating those behaviors on the next generation, but having an impact on the psyche of the children moving forward in time. And all of this really just from watching a few reels on Instagram. And this can go in other directions as well. So maybe I should just generally share my screen at this point, though there isn't always anything to share. But let's watch this reel now.
Not affecting climate change. You're going to tell me that back in the Ice Age, how much taxes did people pay and how many changes did governments make to melt the ice? People are not affecting climate change. You're going to tell me that back in the Ice Age, how much...
So I'm not Marjorie Taylor Greene's biggest fan in the world, okay, personally. So this, I'm going to preface everything by exposing my own biases. But I think that that post was incredibly flippant, because it's basically saying there's nothing to take seriously here. There's no claim, there's no logical claim at all. We're not going to engage with it. When the reality is that there were ice ages and changes of environment way before human beings existed. So I think the question of how much impact human beings have is a legitimate one. And maybe she says things that are dumb in other contexts. I don't know, or I do know, it doesn't matter. But the point is that that specific post I thought was very flippant. Now, maybe it's also logically, what she's saying is logically wrong. I can think of reasons why it would be logically wrong, but that's not what the post was pointing out. It's saying it's dumb, so dumb to have even brought that up in the first place that we're not going to engage with it and we're just going to make fun of it. And I felt frustration because I felt, why does communication on social media have to be actively that bad? And reached all sorts of conclusions about emotional responses and prior beliefs, and the fact that social media is constantly updating and there's competition and evil algorithms. At the base of it all means that people aren't taking a second to think. They need to have a response really quickly. They need to decide how to react really quickly. And I only have a minimal amount of time to get people's interest. And that means that I don't have time to actively think about what I'm reading. I don't have time to think before I'm responding and posting or liking or anything else, which means that I'm not applying logic. And this can be useful in any debate about portrayal of opposing stances or demonization of political leanings in social media. So for example, in This House Would Ban Negative Campaigning, you could run that negative campaigning of this sort often doesn't look like, I'm going to logically explain why the other side is incredibly bad, but characterize it as flippant, as demonizations, taking advantage of the fact that people don't have time to think, or not even taking advantage of it, but also constrained by the fact that there isn't time to explain things in depth, and why it will mostly look like being flippant about things and not explaining them, and impacting that in a way that means that people don't even have the opportunity to engage with other opinions or differing opinions, taking away their ability to choose. I don't know. The point is, all of this was because I saw a post on Instagram that I found really flippant and asked myself why it has to be that way. Now, all of these were my experiences, but you have all, as I kindly asked you to do, shared different TV shows or movies that you've recently watched so that I could look through them and see if there are any examples that I can extract from them. So we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to do 2 or 3. But hopefully this can give you also an example of how we can utilize this framework to do things that to look at things that you're already watching. So let's have a look at this clip from Gladiator. Share screen, sound, good.
Makes a question a good question. Well, I met this woman one time, and I said, when was the last time you touched a monkey?
Anyone here been in the army? Yes. I served with the Vindabona. You can help me. Whatever comes out of these gates, we've got a better chance of survival if we work together. Do you understand? If we stay together, we survive.
Pleased to bring you the Legionnaires of Scipio Africanus!
Okay, gonna stop here. I'm just going to complement this with one other clip from the movie. So this is after the fight has happened.
Slave! Will you remove your helmet and tell me your name?
My name is Maximus Decimus Meridius, commander of the armies of the North, general of the Felix Legions, loyal servant to the true Emperor Marcus Aurelius, father to a murdered son, husband to a murdered wife, and I will have my vengeance, in this life or the next. Okay, gonna stop it here. Just so we can discuss a little bit of what we watched. So I hope you caught that. But what I noticed the most about this clip that we were watching, sorry, 1 second. I'm missing some things. There you go. What I noticed the most from this clip that we were watching was two things. So one, or let me just summarize it for you, I guess. Basically, we saw a gladiator fight. For the first time, these people who don't know each other need to fight together or whatever. And they eventually rally around our protagonist, Maximus, listening to his commands. And then eventually, when there is some danger towards him, instead of running away from the danger, they rally around him as if to protect him. So if they needed to fight the soldiers again, they would do it again. And the second is the crowd also chanting for him to be protected. And the thing I asked myself in this situation is, more on the soldiers, why would they rally behind him to the extent that they are putting themselves in danger to protect him. So clearly there's something going on between him and the current emperor. Clearly the current emperor is mad at him and wants to destroy him in some way and is inclined to kill him. Why is their instinct when he calls upon his guards to rally around him, come stand next to him and make it clear that they're ready to defend him rather than walk away? Because that seems like it would be an irrational decision for people who care most about their own lives or saving themselves or something like that, right? So why would they rally around him? So the question I felt in this situation, the thing that I felt, the emotion, was curiosity. Like, what makes people behave that way? And the way I broke it down is asking myself on what their needs are, and who's fulfilling it. So clearly what they want to do is stay alive. And the person who has proven that he is capable of keeping them alive is whoever just led their battle within the gladiator ring, leading them to win despite the odds, right? So while it's true that they are putting themselves in danger right now when they are trying to protect him, it's also true that he's the only person, or he is the person who has most recently showed himself to be capable of preserving them and saving them in the long term. So it means that even if the need here is to survive, then he's shown that he has significant value. But he's also shown that he is capable of leadership, and the decisions he's made have proven themselves. So they want to listen to what he's going to do and what he has to say. So they're getting closer to him in order to do that. And maybe they have a sense of loyalty because no one has stood up for them like that before, and suddenly there's someone who is actively giving them commands and someone they can rally behind. And they have no hope because they know that they're just going to be thrown into the rink again and again and again, and they don't have hope anyways, and this person is the one beacon of hope they have for a better life, so that they're holding on to him and they're willing to sacrifice themselves in the short term now for the chance that he will protect them or save other people or anything like that. And while I think that this might have all been very specific to a gladiator rink and a situation in which people's lives are on the line, I think it's also possible to analyze why people rally behind leaders or rally behind people in situations that are not with that much stake on the line. So if you reproduce it, if the person has proven that their decisions are good, if the person is giving hope to people who feel like they are hopeless, if the person is defending people who otherwise feel like they are not defended, and if they don't feel like they have a good alternative, they're going to rally behind a leader because of those reasons in other situations as well. So it can be rallying behind a manager, it can be rallying behind a political leader, it can be rallying behind a religious figure, it could be rallying behind a cult leader. So if I understand who the kind of people who rally behind leaders are, even when it's irrational to do, then I can talk about them in a debate when it comes up. And about the crowd protecting him, I think the larger question is, why does he listen to the crowd as opposed to not listening to the crowd? So again, this opponent, this gladiator, has shown himself to be an incredible fighter. He has shown leadership power. He has shown strength. This means that he's posing a very active threat to the emperor if he continues to live. And there is an immediate solution in killing him, but the leader changes his mind based off of the crowd chanting, right? And I want to ask myself, why would he? Like, fine, short term, the crowd will be mad at him, but in the long term, he's removing an incredible threat. What is he scared of? When do people make decisions that are popular for populist reasons as opposed for their own personal reasons or for their own personal safety? And I think that answering those questions can help explain why publicity or transparency can actually hold people accountable to make good decisions or bad decisions, or vice versa, by forcing them into decisions that aren't good for them but are good to the public. So in this situation, for example, I thought to myself that this attempt might not be successful, right? So there is some amount of chance that in the skirmish when trying to kill Maximus, the emperor himself dies. Especially if he is worried that the other soldiers around him trust Maximus more than they trust him, and they won't necessarily listen to him. And when something is likely to be unsuccessful in the first place, then my threshold for doing it has to be higher. And if it's unpopular, it means I'm going to be punished twice if it's unsuccessful. I'm going to be punished for having made the decision in the first place, and I'm going to be punished by and the negative outcomes that come from it, and I'm going to be punished by the crowd or by the public not actually liking me as a result of this or having a more negative perception of me. So this is very surface level, just initial thoughts, but I think if we dig into these two phenomenon, we can reach conclusions that we can generalize and explain, therefore, why in certain situations, public accountability is super important, why it's bad or not, or good, and when it's likely to impact political decision-making in that sense. Maybe I want to leave time for questions, but I think it might come at the expense of another example. But I've also already given several examples, so I'm very happy to just take some time for questions and leave it at that. But if you feel strongly about another example, then we can do that.
I would like another example, if that's okay.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, since you're the only one with an opinion, then that's what we're going to do. Okay, let me just play a clip. 1 second, going to share my screen. Share screen. Share sound. All right, this clip is going to be from young Sheldon.
Would you like to play a driving game?
Not really, I always lose.
I know, that's why it's fun. How about license plates with prime numbers followed by a constant?
Why don't we just talk?
Very well.
You understand that some people are going to be intimidated by you because of how smart you are?
Or maybe they'll recognize my intellect and make me their leader.
Lord, look after my son. Don't let him get stuffed in a gym bag.
Oh dear.
Yeah,
That boy has an exposed tattoo.
he does.
I wonder if he knows that's in violation of the dress code.
Speaking of which, how about we lose the bow tie?
Why?
Look around, honey. None of the other kids are wearing one.
Well, perhaps he'll start a fad.
No, you won't. Please trust Mommy. All right, tell you what. You take it off, and this weekend, I'll take you to Radio Shack. You doing okay?
I guess. I smell ammonia. They must have done a thorough cleaning recently. I like that.
And remember, if anybody bothers you, what do you say?
My dad's a football coach.
And?
My brother's a football player.
Good.
Hey, Mom, look, that girl's pregnant.
Congratulations.
Well, that was revolting.
Right. This is your homeroom. Do you want me to go in with you?
No, although I could have used you in the restroom.
Okay, well, you have a good day, and I'll pick you up after school, same door we came in.
Are you crying or having an allergy attack?
Allergies.
It's probably the ammonia.
Probably.
Okay, let the learning begin.
All right. I will preface this one by saying several things. I have not watched Young Sheldon. It's like, maybe it's possible that the phenomenon I'm going to discuss is explained in detail afterwards. And two, I'm not convinced, but I could be convinced, that this is a portrayal that matches up to real life. So what I would be explaining here isn't necessarily a phenomenon that is likely or happens in real life, but it is if we generalize it. So two questions I had while watching this. So I watched this clip and tried to recognize some phenomenon that I can try to explain using characterization. And the first thing that I thought to myself is, how could he be so surprised at what's expected in high school and what to expect from a high school? So I understand that Sheldon isn't supposed to be neurotypical and therefore not understand necessarily how social interactions work. I'm not going to even attempt to explain it myself. But I would still expect him to understand that wearing a bow tie is not what's expected and that what he's wearing isn't it, if he had just Googled high school attire, for example. So, and I think that this is something that that we see children doing regardless, right? So it's children insisting on wearing fancy clothes to places where fancy clothes aren't necessarily expected, to all sorts of dinners or anything like that, or having a very specific image of what it means to wear fancy clothes and wanting to be like an adult that doesn't necessarily line up with what adults actually are. And if I try to tap into my own experiences that are relevant, then I remember being 10, there was no difference in my mind actually between people who were 18 and people who were 30. All adults look the same basically, or everyone that is older than me to a large enough extent is at the same level. I still experience this with height, by the way. Like, as far as I'm concerned, if you're above 1.70 meters, you're all the same height. I don't care. But it's definitely true for children and their and age. So I can imagine that young Sheldon, or Sheldon in this situation, was told he was going to high school, imagined it as a bunch of adults, because everyone over the age of 16, when you're, I don't know how old he's supposed to be, 8, 9, 10, anyone over the age of 16 is an adult at this point. What do adults wear? Dress shirts, pants with belts and bow ties. So that's what I'm going to wear because I'm going to an adult place. And if we think of situations where people have perceptions of certain social structures that aren't actually monolithic, but they think of them as monolithic in some way, or they don't understand the nuances or distinctions between them, it might lead to them behaving in ways that aren't actually appropriate, or even having baseline assumptions that change the kind of actions they would take. So I think you can take the phenomenon that we saw with Sheldon, where he's so surprised, and analyze it and explain to ourselves, in which situations does it happen where everything that's different enough from me, as far as I'm concerned, is the same thing. And I'm just going to default to my one stereotypic or default view of what it means to be that, and that's it. And the second thing I noticed about this clip is why in the world is his mother letting him go to this high school? Like, it really, like, the first thing she says about it is, oh Lord, don't let him get stuffed in a gym bag. Like, why are you putting your child in a situation where he might be stuffed in a gym bag? Like, she's telling him, what do you tell people? Oh, my dad is a football coach and my brother is a football player. Like, she knows that he might need protection. She's aware that she's putting him in a situation that might be bad for him. So why is she doing that? And that made me think of some of the impossible decisions that parents have to make for their children generally in life, right? It's unclear what the best decision is always. Something has value and it also has harm, and how do you weigh those things up? So maybe you default to tangible benefits. So it's not just hard to explain abstract psychological harms in debate. I think it's also sometimes hard to understand in real life, versus the tangible benefits of having a high school education and being very, very smart and being able to finish things early is a tangible benefit that I can actually understand. So if I have to make a decision about whether to give my son more tangible benefits with the maybe abstract, the possibility of some emotional harm, then I'm going to default because the tangible benefits are more salient to me and therefore I understand them. Or because I am capable of thinking of the long term and think that the long term is more important. So think that the advantages he's likely to get from skipping and going straight to high school is going to be important, more important in the long term. Or maybe I think that there's really no choice. But I think if we take a second to break down the kinds of decisions parents need to make for their children and why they make bad decisions or why they make good decisions, or if they're even a question whether there is a good or bad decision, that's going to be generalizable to anyone making a decision for anyone they're responsible for, and why, what are their incentives, and what are the reasons they sometimes choose bad things or cause harm, and question whether or not there was an alternative. So those are 2 bits of characterization that I could potentially work a little harder and flesh out, and could use in many debates given the generalization process that I've already done. It's, when do we perceive of some group to be the same when they're not actually the same, and it can harm my decision making? And in especially in parental figures, but even just any authority figure, teachers or managers, what kind of decisions do they make when they are posed with a decision that they seem is impossible, and what they default to, and why they might make that mistake. And that's it. I think that basically exactly concludes our time of an hour and a half. If there are any additional questions, I'm really happy to answer them now. If you don't ask now, I don't know what the best, I'm happy to answer questions later, but I don't have access to any social media at the moment, so I don't know how you would do that. But maybe you could message Yael, and Yael could message me questions, and I could, yes, there you go. So message Yael on Facebook, and then if she can forward that to me, and I can answer your questions, or you can ask now.
I have one question actually, about the cheat sheet of like the question that you ask yourself. How did you make it? How do you use it during the prep? If you can explain it a little bit more.
Definitely. I mean, how I made it, I basically sat down, spent some time thinking, what are the questions I asked myself that I found helpful? I put them together in a